Ah, believe me, my young friend, there is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing really seems to matter. That's the charm of it.
Absolutely right, Ratty. Messing about in boats, great fun. Almost as good as reading a favourite book, especially if the book is my favourite, Wind in the Willows. This is my very first copy, dated 1951, when I was 10. And since then, I've read this book many, many times. Why? Because I love it. Kenneth Grahame's book paints a picture of a Britain that, let's face it, I think many of us still hanker after, where life was a little slower, sleepier, leafier and sunnier. And we're taking on fantastic adventures with the book's four great characters. Ratty, Moley, Badger and Mr. Toad. It's charming, it's moving, it's sometimes very sad, but it's also extremely funny. The first character we meet is a mole who abandons his spring cleaning in a bit of a temper and decides instead to go in search of excitement and adventure. So he scraped and scratched and scrabbled and scrooged. Up we go, till at last, pop, his snout came out into the sunlight. And so, on a warm summer's day, Mole begins his new life. Now, a couple of assumptions that it would be perfectly reasonable to make. One is that it was Wind in the Willows which originally turned me on to wildlife. But it wasn't. Actually, it was collecting birds' eggs when I was a kid. And another assumption might be that Kenneth Grahame created his characters by observing real animals. Well, if he did, he wasn't much of an observer, was he? But come on, I mean, real moles don't actually spring clean, you know, and they don't pop out into the sunshine. Moles are extremely shy. They're almost blind, and they are totally nocturnal. And in 50 years, I have never actually seen a live mole. But Kenneth Grahame probably did. In fact, Grahame was an extremely competent naturalist, so he knew perfectly well that the characters he was creating were, if you like, unnatural and unbelievable. And yet they were completely natural and totally believable. Kenneth Grahame wrote Wind in the Willows nearly 100 years ago, and he created it from a series of letters and bedtime stories for his little son, Alistair. We're not really sure how old Mole is, but there's something definitely childlike about him when he finds the river for the first time and he's captivated. And part of Grahame's genius as a writer is that he captivates us too. He describes the river as a sleek, sinuous, full-bodied animal, chasing and chuckling, gripping things with a gurgle and leaving them with a laugh. And when Mole meets a friendly water rat who actually lives on the river, he is entranced.
And you really live by the river? Oh, what a jolly life.
By it, and with it, and on it, and in it. It's brother and sister to me, and aunts, and company, and food, and drink, and, naturally, washing. Ratty and Moley soon become the very best of friends, and together they explore the delights of the river. It's quite simply one pleasure after another, and after the river tour, inevitably Ratty produces, what else, a delicious picnic hamper. The writing literally brings it alive. For Grahame, even food has feelings. A sausage, out of which the garlic sang. A cheese which lay down and cried. And in a kitchen scene, the plates on the dressers grinned at pots on the shelves.
See, even inanimate objects are animated. And talking of animation, you know, as in cartoons, kitchen utensils coming to life. Remind you of anything? Disney's Fantasia, Beauty and the Beast? Well, coincidence or influence, or is it just a daft theory of mine? Well, hang about, because there's a lot more, actually. But first, a brilliant burst of verbal dexterity from Ratty.
Oh, what's inside?
Cold tongue, cold ham, cold beef, pickled gherkins, salad, French rolls, crisp sandwiches, potted meat, ginger beer, lemonade, soda water.
Stop, stop, stop!
Cried the mole in ecstasies.
Oh, this is too much.
Absolutely. Too much, man, too much. Hang on, wait a minute. Tongue, ham, beef, animals eating other animals? Well, I like that, you see, because it's utterly unsentimental, totally unsoppy. Which brings us to somewhere very, very different. The story of Kenneth Grahame's own life. Only a few days after his 5th birthday, Kenneth Grahame's beloved mother died of scarlet fever and his world fell apart. His father was an alcoholic. He was unable to cope, and so he packed little Kenneth off hundreds of miles south to Cookham in Berkshire. After a long journey, Kenneth was eventually met by his strange and unwelcoming grandmother. His new home was the Mount. It was imposing, but not exactly cosy. However, beyond the formal gardens lay another world. A world of water voles, badgers, and toads. And it provided a magical new family for the lonely Kenneth. And it was this world that was to be the inspiration for The Wind in the Willows. Kenneth had found his escape. I certainly didn't live in anything quite as palatial as this, but I do realise now that my childhood actually had quite a lot in common with Grahame's, because my mother was committed into a mental home, and so I was brought up by my dad and a rather unaffectionate granny. In fact, just like Grahame, I used to escape into the countryside. I used to get on my bike and I'd cycle out to a bleak concrete reservoir on the edge of Birmingham. And whatever the weather, I'd spend day after day there watching birds. Even when there weren't any. Bartley Reservoir's a far cry from Grahame's idyllic river bank, but it did, rather like reading Wind in the Willows, allow me to escape into a friendlier world. But do you need to be unhappy to enjoy this book? No, of course you don't. Let's face it, there are millions of children and adults who love this book, who had perfectly happy childhoods. But I think where we do get a sense of the author's unhappiness and indeed fear is in the second part of the book. Here, Grahame, having lulled the reader into a false sense of security with the sunlit tales of the riverbank, introduces a more sinister world, the wild wood. Against all advice, Mole leaves the riverbank, ventures deep into the wood, and finds himself hopelessly lost. You see, Mole, in a very human way, decides that his safe, cosy existence on the riverbank just isn't enough. Surely there must be more to life than this. And thus he enters a world he doesn't understand. And it's in Grahame's description of Mole's traumatic journey that his writing is at its most evocative. He's created the quintessential scary wood, and in it lies the real menace of the book. Then the faces began.
a little evil wedge-shaped face looking out at him from a hole. Then suddenly, every hole, there were hundreds of them, seemed to possess its face, all hard-eyed and evil and sharp. Remind you of anything? Only every spooky woodland you've ever seen in a cartoon, yes? But who are these terrifying animals? Well, they are the true villains of the book, the Stoats and the Weasels. Just when you think that Mole is going to be attacked by the evil of the wood, we hear a reassuring voice. Moley! 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 Where are you? Of course, Ratty has come to the rescue of his friend, and fortunately he knows the wood backwards. And soon they're at the door of one of the wood's friendlier residents, Mr. Badger. Oh, Badger, let us in! Who is it this time, eh? Disturbing people on such a night. Mr. Badger finally invites his guests in to enjoy the warmth and safety of his cavernous home. Badger shuffled on in front of them, wearing a long dressing gown and slippers that were very down at heel, and they followed him down along a shabby passage and found themselves in all the glow and warmth of a large firelit kitchen. And what a complex character Mr. Badger is. He hates social life, and yet he remains civil to his guests. And he settles them down in front of a cosy fire, where he explains the virtues of his underground home. There's no security, no peace and tranquility, except underground. No builders, no tradesmen, no remarks passed only by fellows looking over your wall.
Oh, yeah.
And, above all, no weather. When in the Willows, homes represent stability and safety, and I can really, really identify with that, because I have to admit I am very much a home person myself. But sooner or later, we all have to venture out into the wide world. For Kenneth Grahame, the wide world meant a life away from his beloved countryside. After leaving school, he arrived in London and he joined the Bank of England. He started as a clerk, but rose to the senior position of secretary of the bank. And it was in this role that Grahame faced one of the most frightening moments of his life. On the morning of the 24th of November 1903, a man arrived at the bank and asked to see the governor. He was directed to the waiting room, where he was met by Grahame. Grahame asked the man to come into his office, but the man took out a revolver and pointed it straight at him. Fortunately, the bullets were blanks, and the attack turned out to be the random act of a madman who was sent straight to Broadmoor prison. Grahame returned to work, unhurt, but severely traumatised. Now, is it possible that the madman may have been the inspiration for the Stoats and the Weasels? Or am I reading too much into it? Let's get back to the story. Let's meet the fourth main character in the book, my favourite and everybody else's favourite, the pompous, arrogant, but ultimately lovable Mr. Toad. Toad Hall is an eligible, self-contained bachelor's residence, finest house on the whole river, or anywhere else for that matter. I mean, at least Ratty and Moley and Badger lived in halls, but no, apparently this wonderful house at Maple Durham was one of the models for Toad's sumptuous abode. And no doubt, when he lived there, the sun shone permanently. He lived more or less on his own, which is no doubt why he felt he had to fill his life with all sorts of fads and fancies. And the first of these is when Toad buys a gypsy caravan so that he can explore the wide world. And he persuades a rather reluctant Ratty and Mole to join him. So, all our heroes are calmly trundling along peaceful country lanes when they hear a terrific noise approaching from the distance. Toad sat straight down in the middle of the dusty road and stared fixedly in the direction of the disappearing motor car. And at intervals he faintly murmured, "Boop, boop, 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 boop." And so begins Toad's latest infatuation, the motor car. But it's his love of motor cars that lands him in terrible trouble when he pinches someone else's. Poor Ratty and Moley are very disappointed in their foolish friend. Oh, Toady, especially when he's caught red-handed and sent to court. Oh, wow. Now, this brings back memories, because when I did my very first show, along with John Cleese and Tim Brooke Taylor, the big hit was a comedy court scene. And guess who wrote one of the first comedy court scenes? Yep, Kenneth Grahame. So, Mr. Toad stole a car and is therefore duly brought to trial. Shh, here comes the judge.
12 months for the theft, which is mild, and 3 years for the furious driving, which is lenient, and 15 years for the cheek, which is pretty bad sort of cheek, judging from what we've heard. Yes. Now, tot up to 19 years. Better make that around 20 years, just to be on the safe side. Take him away.
First, make 'em laugh, then break their hearts. In Toad's jail scenes, he's almost like a recovering alcoholic or a tormented manic depressive. It's heavy stuff. I tell you, you wouldn't get Winnie the Pooh doing cold turkey or Peter Rabbit being done for dangerous driving. No. Oh, this is the end of everything. At least, it is the end of the career of Toad. Now I must languish in this dungeon till people who were proud to say they knew me have forgotten the very name of Toad. But for Grahame, Toad was much more than just a comic character. His story was written as a cautionary tale for his young son, Alistair. Sadly, Alistair had been born blind in one eye, with a squint in the other, and he seemed to have suffered from some kind of behavioural disorder. He was actually banned from his local park for kicking and biting every other child he saw. In addition, he had a strange habit of sitting in the middle of the road in the way of oncoming traffic. But despite Alistair's problems, Grahame adored him, and he put all his childhood fantasies on his little son's shoulders. He decided that one way of explaining to Alistair how to be a nicer, kinder little boy was with a series of bedtime stories about a naughty toad. And thus, the famous Mr. Toad was born. But of course, the stories had to have a happy ending. So, with the help of the jailer's daughter, who lends him some clothes, Toad makes a bid for freedom.
Good luck.
Next comes the escape in drag, with Toad as a washerwoman. I am a poor, unhappy washerwoman. I must get home. So, Toad begins his journey back to Toad Hall. Hardly humbled, in fact. Quite the contrary.
Oh, rumpety-tumpety-tum, all the world's held great heroes of history books have showed, but never a name to go down in fame as that of Mr. Toad.
Be honest, Toad is a superstar. In fact, it's no wonder that the creator of Winnie the Pooh, A.A. Milne, turned his story into the perennially popular stage play, Toad of Toad Hall. There are certain parts that every actor surely aspires to play. Hamlet, Richard III, Captain Hook. But the greatest challenge of them all, without a doubt, has to be Mr. Toad. In fact, I think one could say that no actor's career could be deemed to be complete until he's given his Toad. Oh, what a part. You get to wear a distasteful jacket, drive a vintage car, deliver long, pompous speeches, burst into tears, dress up in women's clothes, sing 2 songs, and generally go over the top as only great thespians can. However, when our hero eventually returns home, he's outraged to find that his beloved house has been overrun by the wicked animals from the wild wood, the stoats and the weasels. Luckily for him, though, his friends, Badger, Ratty and good old Mole, have remained loyal, and they're on hand to help their friend, Toad. So, our plucky band of heroes get together, sneak up the underground tunnels of Toad Hall, and surprise their enemy. The 4 heroes strode wrathfully into the room. Mole, Black and Grim, shouting his awful war cry.
A mole! A mole!
Rat, desperate and determined, and Toad, emitting toad whoops that chill them to the marrow. And what a terrific piece of visual writing that is. So, stoats and weasels are vanquished, Toad Hall returns to its rightful owner, and our victorious chums celebrate by tucking in to a slap-up feast. Lashings of chicken, and tons of tripod. And Toad sees the error of his ways, and becomes, in Graham's delightful phrase, a much altered Toad. So, they all live happily ever after. All, that is, except the author of all this excitement, adventure and joy. Shortly after completing The Wind in the Willows, Grahame mysteriously resigned from the Bank of England. He returned to his beloved river bank. But even here, his life became even more tragic. Graham's loveless marriage lingered on, and his son Alistair became more and more depressed. 2 weeks before his 20th birthday, Alistair lay down on the railway line in the path of an oncoming train. It was a brutal end to a sad and troubled life. And for us, the final tragedy was when Grahame decided he would never write another book, despite the enormous popular and financial success of The Wind in the Willows. In 1932, he died, a broken man.
To the beautiful memory of Kenneth Grahame, husband of Elspeth and father of Alistair, who passed the river on the 6th of July, 1932, leaving childhood and literature through him the more blessed for all time.
Not only childhood and literature, you can include me, please. You see, to me, Wind in the Willows is a lot more than just a good read. It's my favourite book because it makes me feel happy. And not a lot of books do that. What's more, it stood the test of time. It's been making people feel happy for nearly 100 years. Through a series of poignant and funny stories, Kenneth Grahame allows us to live for a while in a world we'd all like to think really exists.
Well, for Bill Oddie, the lovable furry creatures of Wind in the Willows provide an escape. Clearly it stirs up lots of emotions in Bill, but what